I think one of the biggest things was I had this expectation that I had to find the angle and find my voice, and then I would start podcasting. What I've now discovered is that you don't sit on a couch and wait and suddenly there's a lightning bolt and now you have your voice and then you can start. It's you start doing it, and through the process of doing it is how you discover, or more, even more than discover, I actually think it's uncover. I think a lot of us think it's like this like journey of like discovering, where you go out like Christopher Columbus and find something outside. And I actually think instead of discover, it's uncover, where it's inside you and it's been there all along, and you have to remove all the stuff from society's put on you. But the only way you can do that is through action. It can't be you're sitting on a couch and you write affirmations and then there's a lightning bolt that comes from the sky and like there's like violins playing and boom, you have it all.
You're listening to the Establishing Your Empire show, a podcast that inspires entrepreneurs, creatives, and future business owners to pursue their passions, grow their organizations, and build their empire. My name is Daran Herrman, and creatively, I'm best known for my photography. Business-wise, my claim to fame is growing a company from $15K per month in online sales to breaking the $1 million a month barrier. And I'm sitting down with interesting people to talk about their process, the lessons they've learned, and how they have established their empires. All right, I got Sachit Gupta here on the Establishing Your Empire podcast. For the past 10 years, Sachit has been the person behind the scenes, working with creators like Tim Ferriss, Seth Godin, and Andrew Warner. Now he's out front and center with his podcast, The Conscious Creators Show, which in the first 30 days ranked number 1 in entrepreneurship, number 2 in business, and number 25 in all podcasts. So I'm really excited to have you here on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that amazing intro.
Oh, you're welcome. So what I'd love to start is, while you're in college or around college time, I heard that you did a TEDx show. Like, I think that maybe it's a good place to start, but like maybe give us that story, how that came about. That sounds crazy, right?
Yeah, looking back, it was. I think back in college, I was always more excited about doing the stuff that I was doing outside of classes and just sort of like doing projects and stuff. The way that TEDx came about was I was reading all of these books, like Seth's book, Tim's book, and I always wanted to be like, I want to bring these stories to the people, to my friends. Like, I was the weird kid in my fraternity who had a copy of The 4-Hour Workweek and I Will Teach You to Be Rich, and was like giving it to my friends in like my junior year in college. So I had another friend in college, Yango, who was also into the stuff. And he had basically applied for a license for the TEDx. And I met him and I was like, I want to help you with it. And we basically decided to do it together. And really, like, the thing for me was all the people that I was inspired by, bring them to our school and create a platform for them to share their message with my friends. And it's kind of crazy looking back. There's a Steve Jobs quote of, you can't connect the dots looking forward, but you can only connect them looking backward. That was sort of also the genesis of what I'm doing now, which is basically creating platforms for other creators and now myself, but on a much larger scale.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, creating a platform for others. Like, I guess, how did you start to get in touch or work with, we have this big list on your intro, right, of creators that you worked with, but obviously you don't just start with one of the big ones, most likely, at least for most people. So how did that come about to where you could work with somebody else, a big name, right?
Yeah, so I'll start with the TEDx part. TEDx was interesting because I remember now, like, we basically had a Facebook page and a Facebook event, and we started emailing all of these people. And I still remember one of the first ones to say yes was Jonathan Fields, who's written a lot of books and has a podcast and everything now. And I remember I sent him an email, basically a cold email being like, hey, we're in college, we're doing this event, would you like to speak? And he was in New York, we're in Pittsburgh. And I remember he like responded asking all of these questions. And I was like, I don't know how to reply to this, because we didn't even have a website. We literally just like had the brand TEDx and the brand Carnegie Mellon. And in some ways because it was 2010, TEDx was only a year old. So it wasn't like, there was some prestige associated with that and like Carnegie Mellon. And then he replied back like an hour or two later, he was like, fuck it, I'm in. And that was like one of the first speakers we booked. And it was really like, at that point, I was just going off people I was reading books. So now the speaker was Chris Guillebeau, who'd had the Art of Nonconformity blog, Chase Jarvis, who is now the founder of Creative Live, and all these things. And yeah, we just like found people. And I think there's almost like being a little naive because you're in college. You're like, of course I can just send them an email and they'll say yes. Another thing I remember, we actually didn't realize that like when you invite people to speak at a thing, you have to pay them, or you have to like at least cover their expenses. We were like a volunteer organization, so we didn't even like know we had to like cover hotels and flights until like a speaker asked. They're like, "Are you covering hotels and flights?" And we're like, "We don't have any money." So some of the speakers actually, most of them actually covered their flights and hotels until we raised some sponsorship, so we were able to cover part of it. So we were just like naive, honestly. But like I think it was a combination of having an idea, having a good team. Like the team was impossible, as in like I'm possible. And then I think it was giving them something that which they couldn't get, which was like speaking at Carnegie Mellon. So I think the combination of those things is what made them say yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think without the at Carnegie Mellon and .edu, that might have been a difficult ask. But, you know, I think that's something important is just asking. Sometimes you never know what will happen. So what happened next? So you have this great TEDx event and then you graduate college. What do you do? What do you do after college?
Yeah, and on what you said about like just asking, I think the kids these days call it shoot your shot. But yeah, I think it's like in a lot of ways, like that's the first thing is a lot of times people will, and I go through the same thing, which like hesitate on sending the email and all these things, and like you have to ask yourself like, what's the worst that can happen? Just send that email. For me, I graduated college, worked at GE, and very quickly knew that like this wasn't the thing for me. So I after a year, I basically ended up quitting my job. And I remember like one of our speakers at TEDx was Chris Galibu, and he talked about like traveling the world. So when I quit my job, I had two choices. I could either go travel or I could like do the smart thing and get a job, right? And I remember calling my parents and I was like, I think I did the smart thing. And I booked a one-way ticket to Bangkok. And like they were not very happy about that. But I was like, I'm not going to get this chance. I ended up traveling for 6 months, then moved to San Francisco to start a business. And I basically sent over a year like hundreds of cold emails to all these companies being like, hey, like I know marketing, like as clients, or and then at some point it was like, just give me a job or something, because I'd been out of like a job for a year and I was like, what the hell am I doing? And for a long time it didn't work. One of the emails I'd sent was to like Andrew Warner, who basically ended up saying yes. We got on a call, and I remember like I presented him all of these ideas and he was like, this is really good, but my company isn't ready to hire you. And I was like, this is the best rejection I've gotten so far, or the politest rejection. And it just, I think like in those moments what you have to do is you just have to keep going and like trying, because at some point something will work. So Andrew moved to San Francisco a few months later, and like he would work out of these offices called Regis. And I was like, if I'm near him, he might like want to like talk or whatever. So I started like working from Regis because didn't have any clients, but I had a membership to their like lounge. So I would just like go there and like send more cold emails. And at one point he was doing this project and he's like, hey, can you help me with this? And I was like, sure. So I ended up helping him, and he's like, how much are you going to charge? I'm like, oh, it's free. He's like, no, I want to pay you. So I remember like my voice was like trembling when I was like, he's like, what's your rate? I'm like, 100 an hour. And he's like, okay. So he wired me like, send me like $200 on PayPal. And that was one of the first like moments of like working and with someone like that I wanted to work with.
And to kind of take a little cut out of the story real quick, I love to talk about doing work for free. So I've been in the photo video world for a long period of time. There's this really negative stigma about, doing work for exposure and free work. What's your approach to doing work for free?
Yeah, so there's this. I don't know if you've heard the story of like Warren Buffett. His professor in college was Benjamin Graham, who was like a very well-known investor, and Warren actually offered to work for free for him, and he was like, no, because this is actually very expensive for me. If you want to work with me, you have to pay me because you're getting like more out of this, right? So I think I agree with the negative stigma. I think, and there's a lot of sort of in creative fields where clients will promise exposure, which like, what the fuck does that mean to people? Like, can I curse and stuff?
Oh, yes, right? You can.
Yeah. Like people like promise like exposure, right? What the fuck does that mean? So I agree with that negative stigma where like, I think actually a lot of like creatives are taken advantage of. And at the same time, I think as a creative, there are certain things or certain people you can work with that strategically can be very advantageous. And also like when you do it, a lot of times it won't work out, but the few times it does, it can change the game. I think a great example is D-Rock and him working with Gary Vaynerchuk. and look at now where he is. I actually learned the strategy from Charlie Hoehn, who wrote this book called Recession Proof Graduate, who used free work to work with Ramit Sethi, Tim Ferriss, Tucker Max, and all of these people. And I basically literally like copied his strategy, copied the emails he had in his book, and sent them to Andrew and a few people. And that's how I started working with Andrew. So I think strategically, it can be an amazing strategy and something I still use today.
Well, and one thing that I always do with the work for free thing is set your expectations up front, not only with the client, but with yourself. Like, and make it like it's a paid gig. Because a lot of times when it's free, expectations is all over the place. Sometimes you fall short because, you know, you're not getting paid. So it's like on priority list pretty low. And what a lot of people don't understand too, and not to get too far into it, but like sometimes you shouldn't take a client on because it might not make sense for you as well. Well, the same thing about a free deal. You gotta interview your client and be like, you know, is this gonna help my skills or my network or whatever it is? But working for free is very powerful. It's something that I did a lot getting early on, and because then you could have a portfolio. You know, you have a book of business, right?
Yeah, if you actually like unbundle it, right? Like let's say like you're getting a job or a gig. If you unbundle it, what are the things you're getting? You're getting financial value, you're getting social capital, right? Like with the relationships that you're building, you can get a brand, right? So like let's say like you work for free with like Airbnb founders when they were starting out. Suddenly you can be like, I was like early at Airbnb. And obviously like coming back, like the biggest thing is skill set. So if you can be part of a journey where your skill set like goes up like this, then you can then leverage that to like get other clients. So it's like, I think most people think of value as just financial, but really like when you're working with someone, there's all these other four forms of value that sometimes can be much bigger than the financial value. For example, for me working with Andrew, one, it got me into the podcasting ecosystem. And like, I wasn't thinking about this stuff back then, but like now, like looking back, it got me into the podcasting ecosystem. But more importantly, Andrew was interviewing successful entrepreneurs. Because now I had a relationship with Andrew, people who were entrepreneurs or successful entrepreneurs wanted to build a relationship with me, right? So like the social capital and the network that I built through that relationship was and is worth more than any financial upside or value.
And to give some context, Andrew Warner, he's Mixergy is the company, which is, they have a bunch of interviews and courses and you know, just a pretty large company by nowadays. I'm not sure what it was back then, but
right.
I mean, very popular. Now it'd be really difficult to work with somebody like that. So
quick thing on that. I don't think I agree, because I think like one of the things I've realized is like no matter what level someone's operating at, they have problems. So if you can identify a problem that you can solve and reach out and solve them, you can still work with anyone.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that is completely true at any level, right? And I think that's the thing is how can you solve their problem? If you are reaching out, that's probably the thought that, you know, how can you provide them value, right? And if you want, you know, somebody that is, say, that's very popular to respond to your email, right, is providing value, it will be the way that you can connect with them.
Another form of value that I think a lot of people don't think about is just gratitude, right? Like if think of you as a creator or someone as a creator, you're spending all of this time doing something. How many people are like coming back and being like, this is the impact it had on me? So if you're listening, there's 10 books that you've loved. Email the authors. Don't ask for anything and just be like, this is what your book did for me. And maybe like if you want to ask for something, like ask them a question that you have and actually apply the answer that they give you. And then go back in 3 weeks and be like, I applied your answer in this way and this is what I did. Like just by doing that, you're separating yourself from everyone else who doesn't do any of that.
It's a great sales strategy as well, as opposed to just kind of close right away, right? Going straight for close, asking for something. Why don't get it into a conversation, a back and forth before asking for something, right? I mean, we're dropping value constantly here. This is great. we haven't barely got past your college years. So, and not like we have to go in terms of time, but so how'd you get your first client? So I know we talked about, you know, work with Andrew. Were you already like working with a bunch of people right there then, or how'd you get your first client as a quote unquote consultant?
Yeah, so I think my first client actually came to me was someone I'd like talked to, and we did like a little project together. It wasn't really anything big. And then I'd done like a few small things like here and there. But yeah, doing that thing with Andrew for $200 was like the first big thing where I'm like, okay, I'm working with the level of people I aspired to work with. So I did that with Andrew, and then actually like right away didn't lead to more. a few months later, we reconnected, and like he was working on this thing where he was sending these bead bracelets to people. And he was like, hey, like I need more of these made. I don't have time to deal with it. Can you just do it? And I was like, here I am with a degree from Carnegie Mellon making bracelets, right? But it's like, and I think that's another lesson is sometimes you just have to do the shit work and do it because that can lead to something else. So he hired me, and like the way I did that project for him was so different than anything he thought. He was like, you think differently. Can I hire you for something else for a week? Which then turned to 2 months, which then turned to an 8-year working relationship where my role started really as like special projects doing whatever he needed to then me being able to be like, hey, I'm interested in this. Can I do this for Mixer? Can I do this? Can I do this? And then he was doing sponsorships, and I was like, can I do that? I think I can do that better. And that became one of the things I'm known for now.
And to get back to the kind of working for free, how it sounded like that one just kind of happened organically, but how have you turned some of those clients from free to paid? Like, has there been a strategy there? Because I think a lot of people get stuck when they do free. They're just always in the free zone.
One of the things I try now to do is if I'm starting something for free, and I don't do it as much anymore, and maybe I should, is just being very clear of setting expectations of what is sort of the result and relationship we're looking for. And then past what point it goes to like a paid contract or something.
I love that. Yeah. Again, like I was saying before, setting the expectations up front. So yeah, maybe just continue kind of the story. Like, so you got this one gig, it's working fantastic. How did you make it into more of a business, right? To where you have multiple clients?
Yeah. So working with Andrew, I was doing all these different things. And at some point he was doing sponsorship and I was like, I can do it better. And he said, try it out. And he had a list of people who had been interested in sponsoring, had a conversation with them, was able to basically double the rates. And he was like, okay, this is working. So I started doing that. And then at other points, I was also doing like Facebook and building websites for people. Really, I think getting clients is identifying a skill set that you have, finding someone who needs that skill set, and basically framing it in a way that's beneficial to them and coming up with a price and doing it.
And one thing that also I think I've even interested in is how did you not just get stuck in having a million clients that is just controlling your world, right? Like, because, you start doing Facebook ads and then all of a sudden, a plumber wants your services, right? Mm-hmm. And that could be great if that's what you want. But I think there's also some pitfalls. So any like tips or tricks in that area?
I'm curious, like, is that something you're dealing with right now or something you faced?
I have faced it throughout my life always, because I think I love closing deals. And sometimes you care about closing the deal more than everything that comes with it, right? And so I'm very self-aware that I have to be careful of that, right? And I have a lot of people that do come my way, right? Which is a great way to do business development, right? Is the funnel is kind of reversed, right? So, but it's always something that I have to constantly make sure I'm not going down that path, because I could kind of feel it usually, and that's usually. But I don't always listen to it, right?
Yeah, I think in some ways, like when you start out, that's what you have to do, right? You like take every client, take every contract or deal that comes your way, and hopefully you can reach a point, and it is a point of privilege where like you can decide who you want to work with. Like once I started seeing that where like there was more inbound than time, I had to get really clear on like who are the type of people I want to work with, what type of clients, projects, and then I think once you have that sort of defined, it really is just about like being good at setting boundaries in terms of what you're going to say yes or no to.
And then did you, at that point when you got enough clients where you can pay your bills, let's just assume that that's the stage you're at. Did you expand services or narrow? Like what was some thoughts there, right, of what you did?
Yeah, for me, I basically cut down the services that I did to like really two, which is like audience growth and monetization through sponsorships. And also sort of made a decision that I didn't want to build a massive agency. I was fine being like few clients and really just like being really great at that. And so that's sort of where I capped it. And I was like, there's going to like for newer clients, there became a lot of hoops that had to jump through for me to say yes.
So that's interesting, because that's kind of opposite of what a lot of other agency owners want, is they want 1,000 clients, not a few, right? Yeah, that's interesting. But that's also probably how you got more well known in this narrow area, right?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's any right or wrong, but I think there's especially online, I see there's this huge fascination with build the biggest business. Like 6 figures is too little. You got to go to 7 figures. No, wait, 8 figures, 9 figures. And I'm like, why are we comparing numbers? Like it feels like comparing something else. I won't go there, but it just, to me, it was just like, that's the laugh.
Took me a quarter second there.
Yeah. And I think for me, I think there's an external journey that happens and then there's an internal journey. And sometimes I think a lot of people use numbers and big businesses to fill holes internally that they're not looking at maybe, and maybe it's for ego. But I just realized, and I still like have that fight sometimes where I'm like, do I want to build a massive business or do I want to do this? And I think that's a decision you have to make as an entrepreneur and a creator is what do you actually want?
Yeah, I completely agree. So you mentioned that you kind of narrowed your services down and one of them was sponsorships. I think, with all these podcasts blowing up, everyone has one, right? Which is, I think is fantastic because I love listening to podcasts. I love the long format. I don't want the 60-second little clip. I want the full story, right? So any unique approaches to sponsorships or anywhere you want to start the conversation? I think I have a lot of questions in this area. So maybe just kind of start wherever you would like with the sponsorships of your approach or how you get started or whatever it would be.
Yeah, so generally what happens in podcast sponsorship is it works on a CPM model. For 1,000 downloads, you get $25 or whatever. When I started doing sponsorship for Mixergy, I asked myself, I'm like, wait, but that doesn't sound right because the audience for a show like Mixergy is very different from some other show, and why are they being valued the same? So when we had the conversation with the first sponsor and I started doing it, I was like, let's not talk about CPM. Like, what is the result that you're looking for? And it's usually customers. And I was like, what are you willing to, in marketing, it's called a customer acquisition cost, which is like, how much are you willing to pay for a customer? And basically with the first customer, I was like, okay, like this is your acquisition cost. Do you think we can deliver you 5 or 6 customers a month? We're like, yeah, of course. Like with the podcast that you have. So I'm like, let's multiply that. We came up with a number and that became the rate. And basically in doing that, we doubled our prices. And so it was an approach based more on the value of what we were bringing than the CPM. And that's how we have continued to sold ads for Mixergy and basically grew it from doing 50,000 a year to more than $500,000 a year last year. And that's just me with my phone and email, and that's it. And I think a lot of people don't focus on the value and like should be focusing on the value they're bringing instead of CPMs.
And when you were talking about that, so you basically were saying, the cost per lead type of thing, which I love. And as a business owner, that's all you really care about is leads. It's the metrics are fancy and they're cool, but really, are you bringing me more customers? Did you have to actually track that data? Is that something you track or you just make assumption out of that, right?
So one of the things I learned from consulting is that, so I'll share the story. When I was doing Facebook advertising for clients, I remember I would send them all these like monthly or weekly reports or something. And there was one time when I sent them the email and I was like PDF attached and I forgot to attach it. And I was like, do I email them? And I was like, let's just see what happens. And I never got an email back saying, where's the PDF? And I was like, they're not even looking at it, right? And one of the things I learned in that is when you're successful, you don't actually need to do that much stuff because like when it's successful, no one cares. So as long as you're delivering, like the way we did it is like the sponsors are tracking data on their end, they have their own systems. And when they're working, like we didn't do that much. Like, but yeah, when it stops working, then you just like go back to tracking, figure out if it's a traffic problem or a middle of the funnel conversion problem, and then you optimize it that way.
I think that's completely correct. I think the only time I ever try to talk about all the stats and all that is when I'm struggling. Like if I'm not actually bringing the customers or something that I thought I would to a client, then I bring up all the pretty charts and this and that, But yeah, when it's working, it's much easier.
Yeah, and then there's this fascinating book, It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work by Basecamp, the Basecamp founders. And one of the things they talk about is like, they tried setting all these like revenue projections and goals and stuff. And like, they just kind of like did that away with this in their company. And I'm fascinated by that too, because I think there's so many different ways in which you can build companies. And I'm not saying that like this way is right or this way is wrong, but I think the act of just being in a position and then like asking yourself these questions of like, what kind of company I want to build? What kind of growth do I want? A lot of founders don't do that.
Yeah, and then you could be 4 or 5 years later, and then and then it gets answered for you, which is not near as fun as planning your own destiny. I also think that could be tailored to somebody when you're just a normal employee of your career is, what do I actually want? What's my 5-year plan? Not, oh, I got this job offer. Should I just take it?
I remember this week I was talking with a friend of mine who's running a very, from the outside, successful business. And he was just like telling me about his business. And I remember I was like, let's do an experiment. Close your eyes. And he did it. And I'm like, imagine like you're in the middle. And then you basically have like these like strings coming from both your hands and your legs that are going out. And they're like attached to like different parts of the business. And your jaws just completely clench and you're like holding on for dear life. Because, if you let go of one of these, the business is going to collapse. And I was like, does that sound accurate? And he just starts laughing because he's like, yep, that's exactly what it is. And I think in a lot of times, like we create these like businesses that end up becoming these monsters, Frankenstein monsters that like, we hate them, right? And one of my favorite books I just recently read is E-Myth Revisited. And I wish I had actually read that when I was starting out, because it talks about like difference being a technician to like actually being a manager in a business. And I think a lot of people, including me for a long time, didn't make that leap. And we basically create these things that we are sort of like idealized versions of what we see others have, not realizing that actually those people hate the businesses that they're in.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So let's go back a little bit on the sponsorships. I think one thing that a lot of people would be interested in is your take on, all right, so I'm not, that's even my podcast, for example, and I'm not as big into sponsorships because I get a lot of other benefits from running a podcast. But like, how would somebody who's got a smaller podcast that's growing, how would they, because I think a lot of people want sponsorships. So how would they get started? What's some advice for them to get their first one or their fifth one or whatever?
So what my belief now, and I'm honestly going back and forth on this. I think if you have a podcast that isn't getting that many downloads, I don't actually think sponsorship is the best way to monetize. Because even if you can like take the CPMs and blow them up and like sell on value, unless you can get a sponsor that has that is willing to pay a lot for a small audience, it's just not as lucrative. And I think there's other modes of monetization, which is doing products or courses or indirect forms like consulting, or now a lot of companies are looking at like subscription revenue with like some things like Supercast and Glow.fm. I think those are much better ways of monetizing by building a direct listener relationship with your audience versus sponsorships where your audience becomes a product.
I completely agree. I also think there's a huge benefit of just your, the worth of your network growing, or if you want to be a subject matter expert in an area, a very niche area, you have a large amount of time to kind of be able to be that, or at least be around the people who are subject matter experts in an area, just to increase your own brand, right? Your own personal brand. And to give a kind of note on that one is the day after I was on Javier Mercedes' podcast, which you've been on as well, I had a client reach out to book our services for Gabato, my marketing agency. And it was a $2,500 a month deal. And it was the day after. And I asked them like, oh, how did you hear about us? And they're like, oh, we heard Daran on a podcast. I was like, oh, boom, right? So something can happen that's completely outside of anything, I think. And I think momentum's powerful too. Like, just doing a lot of actions pushes things forward. So I guess, yeah. So, all right, let's go back to, I guess, the story, right? So you're, things are moving in a right direction. It sounds like you probably just keep getting more and more clients. What happens to you now to where you're like, you now want to be in front of the mic as opposed to behind the mic? How did you make that transition? How's that transition going? Anywhere where you want to take it?
Yeah, it was more of a personal journey last year where I realized, like, as a kid, I was always more of the artist and creator and stopped doing it for a while, and subconsciously entered into career supporting other artists when I wanted to be doing that myself. And then I think like whenever you discover a fear or story like that, you have to like either like just ignore it or face it head on. And I was like, I'm going to face this head on. And last October decided to start a podcast, and it was really fun. It has been really fun. I think it's like, I was talking to a friend earlier, like there's this sort of like journey of now like improving as a creator, because as Ira Glass says in his like gap speech, when you start out, like especially if you have taste, you're not going to be that good. You can't, right? Because you have to put in the reps in. So right now for me, it's just, we've published 20 episodes, had a bunch recorded this year, we'll eventually publish. And yeah, it's just been this journey of getting better at that skill set.
And I mentioned kind of in the intro that, I mean, you guys, like, first 30 days, just a huge blitz, number 1 in entrepreneurship and number 25 in all podcasts. So any advice for somebody who wants to do a blitz of how'd that happen, right?
Magic.
I'm sure.
Yeah, in some ways it was, right? But I think, like, I always tell people, like, the journey I had in podcasting is very atypical. So first of all, like, not comparative, because I spent basically the last like 5 to 10 years just figuring out growth for podcasts. So I knew what to do. With our show, we basically leveraged like a few things, which was being on other shows. So I was on I did an episode with James Altucher, which he ended up publishing in his feed, and he gets like massive reach. So that was super helpful. Combination of that and paid media, we figured out sort of like buying ads on like different publishers and mobile apps that direct to the podcast player, and really like understanding the iTunes algorithm, where I think it cares more about like the rate at which a podcast is growing than like actual numbers. So when you're starting out of a new show and you get like even like a few downloads, your rate of growth just through math is like velocity is way more than an existing show, which makes you go up the charts. So just a combination of those three things. If it was going to work well, we had no idea how well it was going to work. Like, I remember my growth team person messaging me being like, yeah, like I think it was like Monday night and it had broken, or maybe it was close to top 150 in all shows. I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, go look. And I was like, oh my God. He's like, what do you want to do? I'm like, step on the gas. Let's see how high up we can get. And we just started spending more on ads. And yeah, it hit number 25 above Oprah and Trevor Noah and stuff. It was insane.
I also think that now it gives you kind of a power statement. And I have a lot of people that come to me to help them with their resumes. I just do it for fun to help them. And I'm always like, you need some really great power. You know, what's somebody that's going to remember you or your service or whatever. And, you know, to be able to say that first 30 days, you know, you could kind of stop counting after that, right? Besides for sponsorship reasons. But to have that, you know, number 25 in all podcasts on the first 30 days of launch kind of gives people, they basically know that you knew what you were talking about when you want to help somebody do their own podcast, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And I think in some ways that's a journey that has been for me, is like, once that had almost like created this expectation of like being a top podcaster. And I was only like 10, 12 episodes in. And that's where like I had to sort of take a step back, because like I was saying, like when you start out, you can't be that good, right? Because you have to put in the reps. And now for me, it was this sort of like realization that I got that attention maybe too soon. And like I still have to go through that journey of being not that good at interviewing and get better. Like, I think one of my favorite things to do is like look at like top YouTubers and look at like sorted from oldest to newest, and look at their first like 10, 20, 30, 40 videos. They don't have that many views. Even like maybe like Casey Neistat probably does now because he's Casey Neistat, but a lot of them don't, right? Because it takes time to find your voice, find your angle, find like what is like your weird quirk that makes you different and separates you. And so now like I'm way more into that than the number side.
Yeah, I mean, reps always are super helpful. And I love the Ira Glass quote. And what I always take from that is, you know, we all know, especially if you're a creator, you know what you like, you know what good is. And even if and you know what great is, and it's really hard to live up to that expectation. Anything that you've learned now that have your own podcast that you might have wished you would have known when you were, you know, behind the scenes a little bit more and starting out with your clients?
I think one of the biggest things was I was sort of like had this expectation that I had to like find the angle and find my voice, and then I would start podcasting. What I've now discovered is that you don't sit on a couch and wait and like suddenly there's like a lightning bolt and like now you have your voice and then you can start. It's you start doing it, and through the process of doing it is how you discover, or even more than discover, I actually think it's uncover. Like I think a lot of us think it's like this like journey of like discovering, where you go out like Christopher Columbus and find something outside. And I actually think instead of discover, it's uncover, where it's like inside you and it's been there all along, and you have to remove all the stuff from like society's put on you. But the only way you can do that is through action. It can't be like you're sitting on a couch and like you write affirmations, and then there's a lightning bolt that comes from the sky, and like there's like violins playing, and boom, you have it all.
Yeah, it's really uncomfortable. It's always uncomfortable, but you got to deal with it. What happened for me is I wanted to start one for a while, and then priorities is all over the place, busy, all this happening, and then luckily, I think that when you vocalize what you kind of want a few times, other people hear that, and then they start asking you questions, and then I was on a couple podcasts, and all of a sudden it's like, all right, like. There was no lightning bolt, but basically everything I was listening to myself that was pointing towards like, okay, you have all this equipment, you have all this stuff. What else are you waiting for? Right. And I think we could make a lot of excuses of what we're waiting for. So there was some questions I was going to have about your own podcast too, which I don't remember. So I'm going to have to try to remember those. But what about a common myth about running a podcast that is out there, or of something that's supposed to work or whatever? Anything that's kind of out there that you hear all the time, and it kind of makes you cringe because it's not what you see as true?
That's a great question. I haven't been asked that. I'm trying to think. Is there one you have in mind?
No, I was actually just struggling because I couldn't remember the question I was going to say. So I literally, we'll edit this part, but yeah, I was just like struggling there for a minute. You know how it goes.
Yeah. You know what, actually, I think you should actually keep that part in, because I do now have a common myth that like, I think people might assume, which is that when podcasters are doing it, like they know exactly what they're going to ask and like everything's perfect. Right. And because we can edit stuff, like it's a lot of what makes a podcast great happens in editing and post-production, right? And I think the moment just happened, like this exchange, like you forgot what you're gonna ask, and I was kind of blanking too. I was like, I don't know what the myth is, and maybe that's the myth, is like people think that like what they know they're gonna say almost always, when there's actually a lot of times there's editing happening that makes the story tighter and all these different things that you don't see.
Well, I'll tell you that my friend, to go back to on the reps part to be better, my first 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 podcasts, I mean, I was editing myself out so much, just, struggling, get to the point, man, and so the final form was pretty good, but like I was removing sentences of myself talking. I think it relates to another question that I do have for you is, how do you prepare for your podcast? Do you have any rituals or certain ways that you do it, notes, anything like that?
Yeah, so one of my favorite quotes is from Sally Hogshead, which is, different is better than better. So when I'm thinking of a podcast episode, I'm not trying to be better than other podcasts they've been on, but I'm trying to be completely different than other podcasts they've been on. So, and like most things in life, I think like for a great podcast episode, 80% of the work actually happens before you hit record. So when we start, I like asking guests 2 questions, which is, one is, if you've been on other podcasts, what are the topics that you've already discussed? And then the second is, what are topics that you want to discuss that you haven't been asked about? And what I usually do is I take the first list and throw it away, because I'm like, if they have done the same thing over and over, I don't want to ask them about it because it's going to be completely repetitive. And then I take the second list and I start with that. The other thing I do is I try and find people that I know in common, that know them very well. And then I ask those people, what would you ask him? Because it takes the context of the depth of their relationship that already exists and gives me questions from that. And sometimes I'll actually be like, I spoke to a friend of yours, and don't tell them who it is, because now they're like, wait, who the fuck did you talk to? Right? So like kind of like just puts them on a different like edge and be like, yeah, like I was talking to this person, I was told to ask you this question. And so I really like, it's creating these like raw materials before that lead to a good interview, right? I think there's this sort of like, I think, and maybe like there's that assumption, which is like that like a conversation that seems very free flowing is free flowing, when in actuality there's so much work that goes in, and then you almost have to forget it and be in the moment. That creates a good conversation. If you look at like comedians, right? Like stand-up sets, they practice for years testing jokes and all, to finally get to like that 1-hour Netflix special that seems so effortless.
And that's the hard part, is you got to be prepared, but you also don't want it to be like reading off question after question, right? You want it to be a conversation, but it's difficult. To me, I like to prep where I definitely want to know somebody's background. I have kind of a bunch of questions that I have that hopefully I never have to look at, but you never know. So I think you kind of already answered this too, but do you have questions that you prep, like a lot of them, or is it usually just general knowledge of somebody?
I will prep questions once when I'm doing the research and like the questions they give me. Another thing I do is I listen to other podcasts they've been on, because then like automatically, like if they are telling me the same story, my brain kind of like tunes it out because I've heard it. Because I'm always looking for like new stuff. Based on all of that, I'll prep questions. But really, like what I try and do is like come to the like what the opening question is going to be or the theme, and then just go completely into the moment.
Love it. What about booking new people, to new guests, better guests? Any tips or tricks on people trying to get guests to be on their show?
Yeah, I think it depends on what your goal is. For me, it's like I'm looking for like stories that cross different themes. And in terms of tips, it's interesting. Like one of the things people don't understand is like put yourself in the guest shoe, right? What are people looking for? They're either looking for an exposure to a new audience, they're looking for like a different style of interview. So I think if you can show guests that, then really it's as simple as like sending them an email and getting them interested.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree. And to me, it's been just being around, like being involved in some networking events, or, we just had Austin Startups Week this week, and I didn't talk about my podcast at all, but you jump on with this big mic and all of a sudden they're asking questions, and, and they're very interesting people. And I think a lot of people enjoy the format of a podcast. So, getting involved is a lot of fun. You mentioned a lot of books. Do you have any kind of like rituals or anything that you do daily that way you can read, or is there anything that you kind of do every single day that's kind of the same that works for you?
I realize I'm not that disciplined to just like follow like rituals and stuff. For reading, for me, I've tried to do like the read like X number of pages and stuff every day, like has never worked. What I realized is just like I just like reading, so I go through spurts. Like there's times when I'll read like 2 books in like a weekend if I'm like interested. I'm starting to like let go of that expectation to finish a book. So like if I don't like a book, I'll just throw it away. But yeah, beyond that, like no really rituals. I try and follow my curiosity, and now I'm trying to build sort of like a schedule and calendar that lets me do that as much as possible.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I'll have all those books that you mentioned below too in the on the website, and as well as in the show notes, because you mentioned a ton of great ones. Which to me, what I love about nowadays is we have YouTube, so you can learn a lot of things, and books are another fantastic way to just kind of expand your knowledge and learn from other people. What about any crazy stories or favorite memories from working on these other shows, or any of your clients, or anything that you can share, right?
Yeah, I think it was, first of all, it was just like such an amazing experience working with the people I worked with, and I learned a lot. Crazy experiences, I think the biggest ones probably would be like working with Tim on his last 2 book launches, and just being part of that, and seeing what it takes to create that. For me, especially working with Andrew, because we worked together in person when I started, it was really cool to see him in action podcasting in his office, and like seeing how he prepared and like asking him questions. One of the things I learned from him was how sacred sort of like the trust that you have with the guest is. Because if you don't have that, you can't really do a great interview. I remember like one time, because Mixergy is about like certain revenue numbers and all, he was going to interview someone and was like, I don't know if your business is big enough for this. And the guy showed him all his like financials. And like what I learned from there is like, if you've established trust with someone as a brand, that like it just changes the game for you, right? So like I just learned a lot about like trust building and relationships from that.
And that, so you have a ton of testimonials like on your website and stuff, and you hear and you talk all about the trust. How do you even get a testimonial? Like, is that just do you have any ways that? Because I think a lot of people get worried about asking for somebody to talk about them, right? Any thoughts there on the because I even saw like Andrew did he had a great testimonial on you, and I don't know, any tips for people to be able to get that from their clients or from anyone?
I mean, maybe it's come like easy and naturally to me. For me, it was always about delivering results, and then setting the expectation of, hey, if I can deliver, I would love to capture this. And this is sort of like the framework I use. And would you be willing to do that? I think there was a certain point, I don't do that anymore, but even before I work with someone, almost framed it as a requirement that like if we deliver, we want to capture that story. And if this is not something you're comfortable with, that's totally okay. But like those aren't the clients we want to work with.
Yeah, I think that's great if asking kind of almost up front, because then it's not such a weird ask later, right? And I don't think it's a weird ask anyway, but I think a lot of people get uncomfortable asking for those. So your podcast sounds like it's going great. What's the future? What's 5 years from now? Like, where do you see yourself?
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is just like I've really enjoyed the skill of interviewing, and I also know like how much I have to learn. So it's almost like becoming a student of the greats. Like I always tell people, I'm like, study the greats, right? So I've been looking at like Johnny Carson and Graham Norton and Craig Ferguson, like the kings of late night and like different eras. And doing that, I think we're in this like amazing transition where we're sort of like creators are getting the limelight and the credit they deserve. And with the internet, they're like starting to build companies and audiences. And it's just like this like creative revolution where the sort of gatekeepers have gone from like the movie studios to the platforms, and like anyone can create now. And yeah, just being more immersed in that world and creating value for people.
I love it. What about any advice you'd give your 16-year-old self?
Those are things that are like always hard for me because I don't want to change things, because if you change things then you wouldn't end up where you are. The advice I would give is just stick with it because things will get better. And also that you probably don't have to be as serious about stuff as you think you do.
I completely agree with that one. And so this is my last question in every podcast with this is, how would you like to be remembered?
I think as an artist who created stuff that helped change people's perspectives.
Oh, I think that's a fantastic answer. Well, it was a big pleasure to have you on the podcast today, man. I really appreciate it. A lot of value there. And I mean, right off the bat. So I really enjoyed it. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to both our friends, Javier and Moby, for introducing us.
For sure. All right, man. Cheers.
Cheers.